June 4, 1943. Railroad Street, Mexia, Texas. The pencil trembled in the hand of Uniffizier Vera Burkhardt as he wrote cautiously in his secret diary. Notes that, if found by his superiors, could have landed him in solitary confinement. "The Americans must be lying to us," he wrote. "No nation could live in such comfort while fighting a war on two fronts." Moments earlier, through the train window, he had witnessed something that shattered years of Nazi propaganda. Electric lights glowed from every farmhouse, every storefront, every street corner, an unbroken sea of brightness stretching across the Texas plains late into the night. In Germany, strict blackout orders had kept cities and towns in darkness since 1940. Even before the war, only about 20% of German farms had electricity. Yet here, in the country Nazi media called decadent and crumbling, electricity flowed as freely as water. That evening, 1,150 veterans from Erwin Rommel's famed Africa Corps stepped down from the train. Not from cattle cars or freight wagons, but from cushioned Pullman coaches equipped with dining and sleeping facilities. Nearly the entire town of Mexia had gathered to witness their arrival. None of them knew it at the time, but this scene marked the beginning of one of the most profound psychological shifts in modern military history. A steady dismantling of Nazi ideology through the undeniable reality of American industrial might. The true story of Allied victory was being written not only in battle plans, but in production statistics, numbers that would soon challenge everything these soldiers believed about their enemies, their homeland, and their cause. That collapse had begun weeks earlier. On May 13, 1943, in Tunisia, General Jürgen von Arnim, who had replaced Rommel, surrendered along with nearly 250,000 to 275,000 German and Italian troops. The numbers fluctuated as isolated units continued to give up in the days that followed. Among the captured were the Wehrmacht's most seasoned desert fighters, men who had pushed the British all the way to Egypt and earned even Montgomery's respect. Now they were prisoners of war. Among them was Feldwebel Friedrich Radke, holder of the Iron Cross First Class and veteran of the France campaign, twice wounded in North Africa. His diary, unearthed decades later in the National Archives, offered historians one of the most detailed first-hand accounts of how captivity in America reshaped the mindset of German soldiers. Radke's journey from defeat to revelation began at the port of Oran, Algeria, as he and 30,000 other POWs waited in makeshift camps for transport ships. They began to notice the precision of American organization. Each day, thousands of prisoners were processed with an efficiency that surpassed even the Wehrmacht at its peak. Identity cards were photographed and cataloged, medical checkups completed, vaccines administered, and the rights of POWs under the Geneva Convention, explained clearly in fluent German by officers specially trained for this task. But the first real shock came not from discipline or paperwork, it came from the food. Oberleutnant Hans Müller of the 21st Panzer Division wrote to his mother 8 months later, "While we waited at Oran, the Americans fed us better than we had eaten in 6 months of desert fighting. White bread, real coffee, meat twice a day. We thought it was propaganda, meant to impress us. We didn't realize this was just their normal ration." The ships that carried them across the Atlantic, the Liberty ships, were themselves symbols of this staggering industrial power. One such vessel, the SS Robert E. Peary, had been built in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes at the Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California. To any German officer, such a claim would have sounded like fiction. Yet these ships were being produced at a rate of 3 per day at the height of wartime production. After delivering supplies to the front, they carried up to 30,000 POWs back to the United States each month by the summer of 1943. For the captured soldiers, the 2-week Atlantic crossing marked the second phase of psychological transformation. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann of the 90th Light Division described it vividly in letters he later sent home. He wrote that the American crew discarded more food each day than his entire company had received in a week during their final months in Africa. Leftover steaks, loaves of bread, even gallons of milk were tossed overboard. excess that seemed almost impossible to comprehend for men who had lived through scarcity. To the German prisoners, this wasn't just abundance, it was proof. Proof that their leaders had lied and that America's power was not propaganda, but reality. Zimmerman wrote that the Americans acted openly without concern, not to mock us, but because to them such waste meant nothing. Their supply seemed endless. The ships themselves became lessons in American industrial power. The prisoners learned that the vessel carrying them was one of 2,110 Liberty ships built during the war, each requiring 250,000 parts, sourced from 32 different states. From conversations with American guards, they discovered that the engines were produced in 3 separate factories, each building 900 horsepower cylinders later assembled in ports that had barely existed 2 years earlier. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm von Stobern, from a long line of Prussian officers who had served since the days of Frederick the Great, later wrote in his memoirs, "As our ship neared the American coast, I watched the radar antenna turning above the bridge. We believed that only Germany, and perhaps the British, possessed such equipment in limited numbers. Yet it was standard on a cargo ship. It was then I first suspected that Germany had already lost the war." August 2, 1943, Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia. Their first glimpse of America shattered the last illusions created by Nazi propaganda about American industrial weakness. Norfolk Base spread over 4,300 acres, with docks stretching for miles, and cranes loading and unloading dozens of ships at once. In just one day, this single port handled more cargo than the entire German port of Hamburg managed in a week. Gerhard Johann Weber, once a factory worker in the Ruhr before his conscription, counted 47 cargo ships being loaded or unloaded. In his secret diary, he noted that each crane performed work that would have required a dozen men and horses in Germany. Yet here, they operated silently, powered by electricity instead of coal smoke. The prisoners were then lined up and marched to waiting trains. Along the way, they passed parking lots filled with hundreds of civilian automobiles belonging to dock workers. In Germany, private car ownership remained a privilege of the wealthy and the party elite. The Volkswagen, promised to citizens since 1934, had delivered fewer than 1,000 vehicles. Here, ordinary laborers drove to work in their own cars. But it was the trains that stunned them most. These were not boxcars or the cramped 40 and 8 wagons used for troops in Europe, but full passenger coaches. Pullman cars with padded seats that converted into sleeping berths, dining cars with white tablecloths and silver cutlery, observation cars with panoramic windows. Heidemann Radke wrote, "We boarded like tourists, not prisoners." The American guards appeared almost embarrassed by the comfort. One sergeant even apologized that the air conditioning wasn't working properly. Air conditioning. In August, they had believed such comfort existed only on Hitler's personal train. The 3-day journey from Norfolk to the camps in Texas and Oklahoma would challenge Nazi ideology more deeply than any battlefield. Defeat. As the trains rolled through Virginia, prisoners pressed their faces to the windows, seeing an America that defied everything they had been told. Every small town was brightly lit. Martinsville, Danville, Greensboro, all glowed with illuminated shop windows and electric signs. Houses shone with light in multiple rooms. The trains passed factories running night shifts, parking lots full even at midnight. Obergefreiter Meyer, whose father had been a Nazi party block leader in Hamburg, wrote in a letter discovered in 1987, "We passed through dozens of towns that first night. Each had more electricity than all of Hamburg. The guards said this was normal, that every American town had electricity since the 1920s. I called him a liar. He only shrugged and said we would see." In Roanoke, Virginia, the train stopped for water and coal. The prisoners watched as American railway workers completed in 30 minutes what would have taken 2 hours in Germany. Automated coal loaders, electric pumps, mechanized lubricators, every process reflected technological efficiency. Even more striking was the casual wealth of the workers. They wore leather boots that would have cost a German laborer 2 months' wages. They drank Coca-Cola from glass bottles and tossed the empties away without thought. They smoked cigarettes constantly, discarding them half-finished. Feldwebel Hinrich Müller, an electrical engineer for Siemens before the war, calculated that this single railway yard used more electricity in 1 hour than his entire district in Berlin did in a day. The waste was magnificent, he wrote. They left lights burning in empty buildings, fans running in vacant rooms. It was the carelessness of endless supply. As the trains crossed Tennessee and Kentucky, American industrial might was on full display. Through the windows stretched endless factories, each larger than anything most Germans had ever seen. The Alcoa aluminum plant in Tennessee extended for 3 miles along the river, its furnaces consuming 175,000 kilowatts of power, more than the entire city of Munich. Near Louisville, the trains passed the Rubbertown complex, where 4 massive synthetic rubber plants had risen from empty fields in just 18 months. Each employed thousands of workers and together produced 800,000 tons of rubber annually. Germany, despite inventing the process, had never exceeded 120,000 tons in its best year. Oberleutnant Erich Hoffmann, a chemist from IG Farben, understood immediately. In a post-war interview, he recalled, "I recognized those plants, the distillation towers, the catalytic crackers. Each facility was more advanced than anything we had built, and there were 4 of them in one place. They told us there were dozens more nationwide." The trains later passed Ford's Willow Run plant near Detroit, visible from miles away. Built in just 9 months, it produced a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. At peak production, 42,000 workers assembled bombers from over 1.5 million parts supplied by 1,500 subcontractors. The factory spanned 2.5 million square feet and used more electricity than the entire German city of Cologne. Hartmann Verli, a Luftwaffe pilot shot down over Tunisia, pressed his face against the train window as it moved past the massive American factory complex. From his seat, he counted 17 B-24 bombers in different stages of construction. He had been told that American planes were inferior, rushed into production, poorly made, and unreliable in combat. Yet as he watched the assembly lines, he saw a level of precision and quality that contradicted everything he'd been taught. These machines weren't weak or carelessly built. They were simply produced at a speed the Germans couldn't comprehend. As the train moved deeper into the United States, the illusion of Nazi superiority began to crumble. In St. Louis, the prisoners crossed the Mississippi River on the Eads Bridge. Below, barges carried more grain than the entire German harvest of 1942. On both riverbanks, massive grain elevators stretched into the distance, each capable of storing enough wheat to feed a German city for months. One prisoner, Corporal Karl Schmidt, a farmer's son from Bavaria, wrote in his diary, "The Americans move food the way we move ammunition, endlessly and without worry of loss. I watched them fill one barge with enough wheat to feed my entire village for 5 years. The crane operator was eating a sandwich with a slice of meat thicker than our weekly ration." In Kansas City, the train stopped near enormous stockyards, filled with tens of thousands of cattle awaiting slaughter. The air for miles carried the scent of meatpacking plants. German POWs, who had survived on barely 200 grams of meat a week in Africa, when they were lucky, watched American workers eat beef sandwiches during lunch. "They eat meat as we eat bread," wrote Private Paul Fisher. "No, that's wrong. They eat meat as we wish we could eat bread." One guard bought hamburgers for the prisoners, 15 sandwiches with meat, cheese, vegetables, and soft white bread, paying for 20 with a single dollar bill. This wasn't a luxury. This was everyday American food. When they arrived at the POW camps, the shock deepened. Camp Hearn in Texas, constructed in just 4 months, housed between 3,000 and 5,000 prisoners, under conditions better than many had known in civilian life. Wooden barracks with electric lights, flush toilets, hot showers, and central heating stood row after row. Each building contained more lumber than most German villages combined. The camp's hospital amazed the German medical officers. Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Friedrich Bauer, chief surgeon of the 164th Light Division, found himself working in a facility better equipped than many hospitals back home. It had X-ray machines, surgical tools, and pharmaceutical supplies long unavailable in Germany since 1941. All were standard issue for enemy prisoners. They even had penicillin. Dr. Bauer later testified, this miracle drug the Germans had only heard rumors about. It was used freely, even for minor infections. While German soldiers were dying for lack of simple sulfur drugs, Americans were giving their prisoners the most advanced medicine without hesitation. The camp kitchens became another lesson in American abundance. Prisoners assigned to cooking discovered walk-in refrigerators, electric mixers, automated dishwashers, and massive gas ranges capable of preparing meals for thousands. Their daily rations included fresh milk, eggs, meat, vegetables, and white bread, foods German civilians hadn't seen since before the war. Feldwebel Otto Krebs, a former hotel chef from Munich, wrote, "Today we threw away more food than my family has seen in 3 years. It wasn't spoiled, just surplus. Regulations require 10% extra to ensure every man is fully fed. The rest is discarded. I wept as I threw good bread into the trash." By September 1943, America's agricultural labor shortage led to POWs being employed in farms and factories across the country. This practical decision, born of necessity, would end up dismantling Nazi ideology far more effectively than any propaganda ever could. Each day, groups of prisoners were trucked to work sites without blindfolds or restrictions. They saw everything: the endless fields of corn and wheat, factories running day and night, stores filled with goods, parking lots full of cars, and homes equipped with refrigerators and radios. At a cotton gin near Houston, prisoner Herbert Lang watched a single machine process more cotton in 1 hour than his entire village could have managed in a month. The gin ran on electricity from the Colorado River Authority, part of a rural electrification program that had brought power to nearly every Texas farm by 1943. The farmer wasn't anyone special, Lang recorded. Not nobility, not a party man, just an ordinary farmer. Yet he had electricity, running water, a truck, a car, and a tractor. His workers, even the black ones, ate lunches containing more food than German laborers received in a week. Every farm we passed looked the same, and this was entirely normal. In Nebraska, prisoners worked in sugar beet fields, witnessing levels of mechanization they could hardly comprehend. A single combine harvester, they learned, could replace 100 men. The fields stretched endlessly, each one larger than entire German counties. Farmers casually discussed yields that sounded impossible back home: 60 bushels of wheat per acre, compared to Germany's 30 on the best land. Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann, working on a farm near Scottsbluff, wrote, "The farmer's 16-year-old son drove a tractor worth more than everything my father earned in his life." When Hoffmann mentioned this, the boy laughed and said it wasn't even a particularly good tractor. His father was waiting for a newer John Deere model. The greatest shocks, however, came to those prisoners assigned to work near American factories. While the Geneva Convention forbade work directly tied to war production, POWs could still work in industries that freed Americans for military duties. This allowed thousands of Germans to see American industrial power firsthand. At a Campbell's soup plant in New Jersey, prisoners watched machines process more tomatoes in 1 day than most German factories could handle in a month. The plant ran with a small crew of women and elderly men, since most young men were in uniform, yet output exceeded peacetime levels. Stabsfeldwebel Ernst Wagner, who had worked in a German food processing plant before the war, described the scene. Everything was automated: electric conveyors, automatic fillers, and steam cookers processing hundreds of cans at once. An elderly woman managed controls that would have required 50 workers in Germany, all while listening to the radio and drinking coffee. Near Detroit, prisoners unloading coal at a power plant saw glimpses of the auto industry's conversion to war production. Across the river stood the vast River Rouge complex, employing 100,000 workers building jeeps, aircraft engines, and tanks. The plant consumed 1.5 million kilowatts of electricity per day, more than the entire city of Hamburg. Oberrichter Franz Kellner wrote, "We could see the parking lots filled with workers' cars. In Germany, even officers rarely owned cars, yet here factory workers had one, sometimes two, one for work, one for family. The guards told them this as if it were normal. The prisoners thought it was mockery." By winter 1943, these experiences had produced what American intelligence officers called ideological collapse syndrome among prisoners. The Special Projects Division, a secret re-education initiative under the Provost Marshal General's office, reported rising requests from prisoners for American books, newspapers, and educational materials. Major Paul Neeland wrote in December 1943, "The prisoners no longer argue when shown production statistics. They've seen too much. Even the most loyal Nazis have gone quiet. They still claim loyalty to Germany, but no longer speak of victory." Camp newspapers, produced by prisoners, reflected this shift. Der Ruf, published at Fort Kearny, Rhode Island, gradually moved from nationalist defiance to discussions of democracy, economics, and post-war reconstruction. Editors, anti-Nazi prisoners, found an increasingly receptive audience. Lieutenant Hermann Gutz, captured with the 10th Panzer Division, wrote in a censored letter, "We were told America was a mongrel nation, weak, divided, run by Jews, incapable of war. Every day here I see the opposite. This is the most organized, unified, and powerful nation on earth. We were deceived by criminals." The most devastating blow to Nazi ideology came unexpectedly, from how the U.S. treated Italian prisoners after Italy's 1943 surrender. Italians who cooperated formed Italian service units, receiving better pay, housing, and freedom. Germans watched their former allies work alongside Americans, eat in restaurants, and even date American women. Heidemann Friedrich Schultz wrote, "The Italians betrayed us, yet they are treated better than we ever treated them. They work freely, earn wages, send packages home. The Americans show no hatred. The democracy we were taught to despise seems more honorable than our own." Christmas 1943 delivered the most profound emotional impact. American churches and civic groups sent 500,000 Christmas packages to German prisoners, men who had tried to kill Americans only months before. Each contained cigarettes, candy, toiletries, and games. Communities invited prisoners to Christmas dinners, though most were not allowed to attend. At Camp Hearn, Texas, a Methodist church choir sang carols in German, and women sent homemade cakes and cookies. Boy Scouts delivered handmade cards. This kindness shattered the last remnants of Nazi racial ideology. Oberleutnant Walter Müller, whose brother had died in Hamburg's bombing, wrote, "They know we are their enemies. Many have family fighting against us. Yet they show us true Christian compassion. Not propaganda, but genuine kindness. Only people absolutely secure in victory and power could treat enemies like this." The Christmas meal itself was beyond belief. Turkey, ham, mashed potatoes, vegetables, pies, and ice cream. Quantities unseen in Germany since before the First World War. "We ate like kings," wrote Feldwebel Hansen. "Better than generals, better than party officials." Guards told them this was a normal American Christmas dinner. Prisoners wondered, if they fed captives like this, what must their soldiers eat? By early 1944, more than 40,000 prisoners were enrolled in education programs. They studied English, U.S. history, mathematics, and science. The University of Chicago offered correspondence courses. Stanford sent professors to teach democracy and economics. The hunger for learning was insatiable. Men who had been told Americans were uncultured barbarians discovered vast libraries, open universities, and world-leading research. They read American newspapers freely, comparing opinions, something impossible under Nazi control. Dr. Wilhelm von Braun, a physicist from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, attended atomic physics lectures at Camp Shelby. He later wrote, "American professors, including Jewish refugees, taught us without hatred. They spoke of science as belonging to all humanity. They were years ahead of Germany. and they shared knowledge even with enemies. Camp theaters showed not propaganda but regular Hollywood films. Prisoners watched Gone with the Wind, a story of defeat and recovery that mirrored their own experiences, and The Grapes of Wrath, stunned that Americans would show social criticism to enemies. "They hide nothing," wrote Lieutenant Joseph Kramer. "They show failure and injustice openly. It makes them stronger, not weaker." In Germany, such honesty means death. Here, it is patriotic. By spring 1944, prisoner labor programs expanded as American production peaked. Germans worked in canneries, mills, and factories, witnessing industrial power beyond imagination. At the Higgins Boat Factory in New Orleans, they watched 20,000 workers, many women, produce 700 landing craft a month. Stabsfeldwebel Kurt Zimmermann wrote, "Women welding steel, black workers operating machines, teenagers running drills. Everything we were told democracy couldn't do. Yet production never stopped. They built more boats in a month than our Navy built in a year." At Republic Steel in Ohio, prisoners saw 10,000 tons of steel produced daily. Blast furnaces ran non-stop, fed by endless trains of ore and coal. "They wasted more steel in spillage than we could produce," wrote Oberrichter Paul Hartmann. "Their workers complained about overtime while outproducing us tenfold." The 1944 harvest season erased the last illusions of American weakness. Across the Midwest, prisoners saw vast farms capable of feeding the world. In Kansas, single farms produced more wheat than whole German provinces. Combines moved like ships through golden seas, harvesting 100 acres a day. Farmer Franz Weber from East Prussia wrote, "One American farmer with machinery does the work of 100 Germans. They showed me aerial photos, miles of wheat. They could lose half the crop and still outproduce Europe." In California's Central Valley, prisoners picked fruit from endless orchards, shocked as perfect fruit was discarded for minor blemishes, food that would have been precious in Germany. Some crops were even destroyed to stabilize prices. "They bulldozed mountains of oranges because they had too many," wrote Otto Schultz. "We begged to send them to Germany. The guards were sympathetic but said it was impossible." The waste itself proved the abundance of American resources. When news of the Normandy invasion reached the camps on June 6, 1944, ideological collapse was complete. The scale, 6,000 ships, 11,000 planes, 150,000 men in the first wave, showed industrial and logistical power far beyond Nazi reach. At Camp Shelby, prisoners watched newsreels of the invasion. Floating harbors, endless supply lines, 15,000 tons of cargo landing daily. They saw their homeland crushed by the nation they were told was weak. Friedrich von Tauben wrote, "We knew then everything was lost, not just the war, but the Nazi dream itself. We sent horses against trucks, rifles against machines, myths against reality. What broke Nazi ideology most, however, was not American power, but humanity." Despite propaganda portraying Americans as sentimental and weak, POWs found a people strong enough to be merciful. When Hans Müller's son died in the Hamburg bombing, the U.S. camp commander personally delivered condolences. When Paul Fisher's wife wrote that she couldn't feed their children, American churches sent food parcels to an enemy nation still under bombardment. "They told us they fought Hitler, not Germans," wrote Otto Heidmann. "We thought it was propaganda, but it was true. They prepared us to rebuild Germany, not destroy it." Medical care deepened this impression. German doctors worked alongside Americans, learning advanced procedures. Prisoners received surgeries available only to Germany's elite. Mental health care, unknown in the Wehrmacht, was common. Dr. Friedrich Bauer wrote, "They treated suicidal prisoners with compassion, not punishment. They gave therapy, not beatings. This mercy revealed a strength we never understood, the confidence of real power." By March 1945, the secret re-education program showed astonishing results. Over 25,000 prisoners volunteered for democracy courses. Camp newspapers debated free markets, civil rights, and Germany's post-war future. The program's success surpassed all expectations. Prisoners who had once been devoted Nazis began writing essays about rebuilding democracy. Officers who had sworn allegiance to Hitler started planning how to apply American farming techniques in post-war Germany. "We became missionaries for democracy," admitted Oust Hermann Göring, unrelated to the Reich Marshal, in a 1975 interview. "Not through coercion or propaganda, but through observation. We saw it work. We saw ordinary people living better than German aristocrats. We wanted that for Germany." The transformation was so profound that American officials worried prisoners might become overly enthusiastic about American life. Some even asked to remain in the U.S. after the war, while others married American women through prison correspondence programs. Thousands later immigrated to America during the 1950s. In April 1945 came the final awakening. As U.S. forces liberated concentration camps, the footage was shown to German POWs. Many initially dismissed it as propaganda, but the evidence was undeniable. First-hand accounts, photographs, newsreels, and eventually letters from home confirmed the atrocities. The emotional toll was immense. Men who had clung to a sense of German honor now confronted the moral collapse of their nation. What they had fought for was not just defeated. It was evil. Sergeant Walter Schmidt expressed it best. "We thought we were soldiers for a noble cause, but we discovered we were tools of criminals. We believed we brought civilization to lesser peoples, but we found we were the barbarians. The Americans we called weak and decadent showed us what civilization truly meant." By May 1945, as the war ended, German POWs faced repatriation with conflicting emotions. They had seen an America that contradicted everything they had been taught. They ate better as captives than they had as soldiers, and were treated with more respect by their enemies than by their own leaders. In their final months of captivity, they prepared for return to a shattered homeland. U.S. authorities provided job training, agricultural instruction, and political education. Prisoners learned about what would become the Marshall Plan, understanding that America aimed to rebuild, not punish, Germany. "They prepared us to rebuild our country," wrote Ost Friedrich von Tauben. "They gave us skills, knowledge, and hope. They turned defeated soldiers into future citizens." This generosity was difficult to comprehend for minds shaped by Nazi cruelty. Between 1945 and 1946, 371,683 German POWs were returned home from U.S. camps. They came back to a divided and devastated Germany, but they carried something invaluable: first-hand knowledge of how a democratic industrial society functioned. These men, who had witnessed American prosperity and efficiency, became silent contributors to Germany's recovery. They had seen that reconstruction was possible, because they had lived within a nation that had achieved it. Many of them later played major roles in rebuilding West Germany. Hans Kroll, once held at Camp Shelby, became West German ambassador to the U.S. Walter Hallstein, who taught in Camp Koch, became president of the European Commission. Rüdiger von Marx, detained at Camp Herne, became Germany's representative to the United Nations. Eduard Ackermann, imprisoned at Fort Robinson, became a leader in agricultural reform. They brought American efficiency to German industry, democratic ideals to German politics, and modern farming methods to German agriculture. The West German economic miracle of the 1950s was built, in part, on lessons learned in U.S. prison camps. "We learned that prosperity came from freedom, not conquest," wrote Kroll in his memoir. "We saw that democracy created wealth, that diversity brought strength, and that respect for workers increased productivity. These lessons shaped the foundation of modern Germany." Historians have called the German POW experience in America one of the most successful re-education programs ever attempted. Without coercion or formal propaganda, American democracy and industry turned staunch Nazis into future Democrats, not through words, but through what they observed. They saw a society running efficiently while treating its enemies with respect. They witnessed a standard of living that made Nazi promises seem hollow. Dr. Arnold Kramer, a leading historian on the subject, summarized it this way: "America won the propaganda war not with slogans, but with reality. Every meal, every light bulb, every working toilet was an argument against Nazism. The prisoners were converted by prosperity. The statistics confirm the scale and success of the program. 371,683 German POWs held in America, with fewer than 1% attempting escape. Just 2,222 recorded attempts, none permanently successful. Surveys after the war showed 95% rated their treatment as good or excellent. Thousands kept in touch with American families for decades. In 1985, marking 40 years since the war's end, over 500 former prisoners returned to Austin, Texas, for a reunion, many bringing their families to show where their transformation began. Former officer Hans Vea, once held at Fort Robinson and later a doctor in Maine, said, "Life in the camps was better than many of us had ever known. We discovered running water, central heating, and plentiful food. But more than that, we discovered dignity." Former Sergeant Kurt Meir, who worked on Iowa farms, added, "The farmers treated us not as enemies, but as young men far from home. They shared meals, knowledge, even their homes. Their kindness changed us forever." At that reunion, 78-year-old Ust Hermann Göring delivered a speech that captured the heart of their transformation. "We came to America as enemies and believers in a lie. We left as friends and Democrats. America showed us that strength comes not from conquest, but from creation. Not from hatred, but from cooperation. Not from tyranny, but from freedom. We saw a nation that built rather than destroyed," he continued. "We returned to Germany with a mission: to build a country that could prosper through peace, not war." The Germany that rose from the ashes was shaped by lessons learned in American prison camps. We who arrived as conquerors left as students. To America, from your former enemies, now your friends. Thank you for showing us the way. The audience rose in applause, honoring a transformation few would have believed possible in 1943. The scale of the POW program itself was enormous. More than 500 camps across 45 states, all except Nevada, North Dakota, and Vermont. Each camp was built in about 90 days, housing between 250 and 12,000 prisoners. At its peak in May 1945, the U.S. held over 370,000 German POWs, with thousands arriving monthly. Their contribution to the wartime labor force was immense. 14 million man-days of farm labor, 100 million board feet of lumber processed, and over 230 million in labor value. Educational programs thrived. 40,000 attended classes, 135 camp newspapers circulated, and thousands studied English, vocational trades, and even university correspondence courses. After the war, about 5,000 immigrated permanently to the U.S., and more than 12,000 stayed in contact with American families for an average of 31 years. Surveys showed that 74% said captivity had changed their worldview, and 61% developed an interest in democracy. Fewer than 10% still held strong Nazi beliefs by 1945. The German POWs who witnessed American industrial power were not merely observers of history. They were transformed by it. Captivity became education. Defeat became enlightenment. Imprisonment became liberation from ideology. Ultimately, America's greatest victory was not won on the battlefield, but in its prison camps, where the realities of democratic prosperity achieved what armies could not: the complete transformation of enemy minds. Those who arrived believing in German superiority left understanding American strength. They had witnessed a level of industrial and social achievement unimaginable under dictatorship. The trains that brought them to captivity in 1943 carried warriors of the Reich. The ships that took them home in 1946 carried future builders of democracy. Their story stands as proof of a deeper truth. The most powerful weapon in America's arsenal was not its military might, but the undeniable evidence of what a free society could create. The German POWs were astonished by America's industrial scale, but ultimately they were changed by it. In their transformation lay the seeds of Europe's post-war recovery and the final defeat of the Nazi vision. They returned not as conquered enemies, but as witnesses to the success of freedom. The economic miracle that rebuilt West Germany was rooted in lessons learned behind American fences. That prosperity grows from liberty, that dignity is more powerful than domination, and that democracy, not control, drives true progress. They had come expecting a divided and weak America, yet found an industrial powerhouse sustained by freedom and humanity. They had arrived as prisoners of war and departed as witnesses to the strength of democracy. In their awe at America's abundance lay the foundation for the post-war alliance, the Marshall Plan, and the democratic rebirth of Germany. They had seen the truth and would never be the same. The story of the German POWs in America is one of redemption through realization. It shows that the greatest victories are achieved not by destruction, but by demonstration, not through propaganda, but through prosperity, not through hatred, but through humanity. The soldiers who once fought for tyranny became advocates of freedom, transformed not by force, but by the undeniable example of what free people can achieve together. In the end, that was America's true secret weapon. Not its armies or its weapons, but its ability to turn former enemies into lifelong friends through the power of example.